Hello everyone. Now it's almost the culmination of what we have been discussing on innovation, business, entrepreneurship. We will now divert our discussion slightly towards strategic perspective, how to drive innovation or how to look for innovation with reference to market and especially competition and going beyond competition. It's an important perspective because innovation requires time, investment and energy. Energy in all terms. You have to bring in people together. They spend a part of their life to go for that particular kind of innovation, and if it doesn't culminate into where you have actually realized the fruits of the same, then it goes in vain. And if we calculate or analyze that kind of wastage, although it is required that we should not precisely call it a wastage, but still we analyze that if somehow we would have engaged those kind of resources somewhere else, what would have been the resultant. So that is that kind of an analysis one has to think of while we are looking for such kind of a progression. So but before going for that kind of a view wherein we think in terms of should we go for conventional competition based kind of innovation, or let us say we think in terms of going beyond competition, we should be looking towards innovation with the context of its definitional perspective as well as the patterns associated with innovation. So first of all, let us briefly visit or revisit the definition of innovation and then try and analyze the kind of how is it related to products and processes, and then how innovation has a particular kind of a pattern associated with itself as well as the entrepreneurial perspective it propels. So going by a widely accepted definition, the process whereby new and improved products, processes, material and services are developed and transferred to a plant and or market where they are appropriate. So it says it all. It takes you towards definitional perspective of marketing as well as strategy and entrepreneurship also and business at large, wherein it refers to a place where you find it appropriate. It refers to products, it refers to processes, material and services and development of all. So that is where innovation, but you would realize that it also refers to improvement apart from being referring to new, something new. So and as we have discussed already, it encompasses products, processes and markets, wherein you can visualize the role of innovation or let us say the impact and application of innovation either in all three of the aspects, products, process and markets, or let us say one of those, or one by one in all of those. So any of those kind of conditions that happen. So looking at this definitional framework, one can choose to refer to several examples in relation to, let us say, products. When you go for an incremental change in, let us say, automotives, wherein you go for a new kind of an engine technology, or let us say you go for a cabin which is different, or interiors which are different, or kind of dimensions which change the shape and design of the automotive in that kind of a particular segment. And so many things can be done. There are radical changes wherein people are thinking in terms of driverless cars, and that is already a reality now. People have been thinking in terms of several other changes wherein how cars would be run. So electric cars are there, and solar panel based cars are already there, and so on. So it is actually, you know, an incremental change. And sometimes when cars would have, you know, come, so it would have been a new kind of a product actually. So new and an incremental perspective. Although new products are difficult to emerge and evolve, most of the times we realize that it's a logical progression of a particular kind of a product, or let's say a need which is fulfilled by that kind of a product, and this progression takes the existing product into a different kind of a newer shape, where after a stage it looks like new, but somehow it is an improved version of whatever we have been doing. But when it entirely gets changed, then we tend to call it new. So there is a diminishing line between new and improved kind of. So that has all to be also to be discussed kind of. Then there are processes. How do you do that? Today, when you talk of these kind of courses which are being floated on the open source, or let's say internet, then processes of disseminating education, we realize, have already changed, and the contact between the students and the faculty, the processes have already been changed. So there are several processes which have been introduced in several spheres of life, and for example, today we have remote surgical procedures wherein doctors, they stand somewhere and they try to perform robotic surgeries, or they try to guide the surgeries which are going far away. So there are several, telemedicine is there. There are several processes which have changed. Material has come a long way, and today we find that material knowledge has changed the entire world, wherein how to use, although there are positive and negative sides which we have already referred to. For example, plastic has become detrimental, but several other material, they have brought in kind of larger feasibility as well as approach for the customers with reference to the existing products, especially in, for example, medical equipment, or let's say artificial limbs, as I was referring to yesterday, and several other things, aeroplanes and other technologies as well, and services. It has taken a different kind of a form when we talk of services, and the entire gamut of services have changed. So there are products which tend to get converted into product and services, products supported by services, or services have changed their context as far as, provision and those kind of things are concerned. It is slightly beyond when we go into that domain, but we all realize that it has entirely changed. For example, postal services has changed into courier services, and internet has supported different kind of a service development as far as this segment goes. So entirely there are so many things which have entirely changed their forms actually. So now going for how this looks like in in let's say few dimensions. So one you have product and processes on one side, and on the other side you have usage or a problem which is being addressed by the product, the process, the material, the service, as we have seen in the definitional perspective, or we can look at it with the usage perspective also, how it is supporting. For example, if you are looking at a mobile phone as a device through which you can communicate, it has a particular kind of a communication based usage. It is solving the problem of getting connected to people. On the other side, if you utilize that same mobile phone for listening to music or watching movies, it has a different kind of a context as far as usage goes. So one device can also have multiple usage, and it can solve several problems also. So we have to look at products, processes, material and services with similar kind of a perspective, but the dimensions say that, for example, usage and problem can be differentiated into new, as well as product and processes can also be differentiated into new, and then we find that 4 different kinds of categories, they get evolved. Now look at, for example, product is new, and problem it solves or usage is old. Then it comes in category 1, wherein new solution to an old problem. This is the first category we are addressing here. And the example which is suggested by authors is product, let us say new medication, process is just in time, and but it is kind of not entirely a new usage addressed by a new product. So, it is one category which we can see. For example, I have already referred to transportation, and I have already referred to kind of music. Earlier we used to listen music through a particular kind of a device. Now new product has evolved, and but the usage is kind of old. So, that can also be seen with that kind of a perspective. Although I must remind you here that there is a very thin diminishing line when we refer to these kind of categories. Many products you would find that they can suitably fit into one or more category if you look at those products or processes with a different kind of a perspective where you stand, and you can logically debate on that as well. But then broader demarcation takes us somewhere, and it takes us towards a logical kind of a conclusion also. Then comes in category 2, and there we call there is no innovation at all, because product is old and the usage is existing usage or old usage. Can we talk about conventional books in those terms? Kind of. But although it is also debatable how conventional books have changed their printing patterns and forms, then can we say that those books come under new sort of or improved sort of product, and there is an innovation as far as presentation of content goes? It is debatable, wherein you have a conventional book in your hands and you say that this is an old product solving an existing problem, or let us say it has a particular kind of an old usage. But then if you change the formatting, or let us say content presentation, or let us say structure, so can we say that it comes under category 1? It is slightly difficult to categorize those kind of things. For example, e-books. Now e-books are sort of new, they are solving different the existing usage. So, can we say that it is a new product solving or the existing problem, or let us say has a particular kind of an old usage, and it comes under category 1. So, there is a slight kind of thin line between as how we look at things, but still we can categorize books under category 1 and existing books under category 2 as such. So, category 3 comes in, it is the most innovative category if you may look at this, wherein product is new, or let us say product and process is new, or process is new and the usage and the problem it solves is also new. And for example, in 1980s the authors have referred to as computer or personal computer, and process is also referred to one of the process called barcodes for inventory control, wherein product was new and it is solving a newer kind of a problem. So, that is where kind of entirely new product which comes into existence in terms of computers, and then it is solving so many problems associated with as far as daily lives, or let us say computing or forecasting or programming in terms of so many things. It has changed the entire world if we look at it. So, there are interesting lists which are being published by several magazines or journals which suggest that which product do not change their form entirely, and which products they change their form, have changed their form slightly, or which products have changed completely, or which products have evolved, some of the products have evolved entirely new as far as this world goes. So, for example, Popular Mechanics publishes the list of 2 kinds of lists or 3 kinds of lists, wherein they publish one list consists of 100 products which have not been changing their form. For example, stapler. Now, stapler is an old product and solving a particular kind of an old problem, and it might not change its form in due course of time. And eyeglasses, for example, there is a less scope for eyeglasses to change its form. In there are innovation based kind of changes which have been made to eyeglasses, but largely the structure, the frame, the bridge, everything is kind of similar when we talk of eyeglasses. So there are products which might not change their form at all, and keep on satisfying a particular kind of a purpose which would or tends to exist in all its existence. And there are several other similar kinds of products which are being referred to. For example, Matchbox, it remains or tends to remain like whatever it was, and so on. So it's an interesting list which they publish. And on the other side, there are products which are continuously on the way of getting improved or incremental changes in their usage also, as well as their product evolution also. And you find that things have come a longer way, and those products are quite evident all over. And this computer based, or let us say technology based products, they have a higher tendency of getting changed in due course of time. Mechanical products, or let us say physical products, they have lesser tendency to change. For example, we look at furniture, we look at chairs. So you find that the basic structure and fundamental form of chair or table remains the same, but there have been so many incremental changes in the outlook, or let us say, so usage remains whatever it has been, but there has been a substantial incremental change, definitely because of material which is being utilized now, and the designing element which goes into it. So IKEA Furnitures, when you visit their website, you would realize that they have so many products to showcase which have been continuously changing. And it's an interesting case study of Lego toys, if you will look at it, wherein you would find that Lego toys, they produce plastic bricks which have a universal kind of a shape. But at the end of the day, you would realize that they have come a long way, wherein they have taught the world that how those bricks can be formed and reformed into several kinds of structures, and that is their victory, wherein they have enhanced their market presence and sales of this conventional product to an extent where it Lego has been termed as the toy of the century for many times, wherein people have tend to understand that this simple plastic bricks which is produced in billions of numbers by Lego toys can be utilized for several kinds of purposes. So that is a very interesting kind of a thing which Lego is known for. So there are several inventory procedures which have come a long way, as just-in-time system is referred to here, and then barcodes and inventory control systems have. You have several kinds of other codes which exist now, and so on. So then comes in category 4, wherein old products process used in a newer way. So paper clips are referred to as, DVDs are referred to as, or let us say flash drives, they are referred to as, and process is testing soils with satellite imagery, and similar kinds of examples are being given. So one of my favorites is that earlier bicycles were used as a mode of transport, and individual transport, but today bicycles are used for several purposes, including health maintenance and so on, and then recreation also, and going a long distance by your car and then you're moving around on your bicycle. That is so it has come with a complementary role also, and so on. So you have realized that product has not changed at all as far as its basic structure goes, but usage has evolved into different kinds of with different kinds of perspectives, satisfying different kinds of wants, or addressing newer kinds of needs in due course of time, when people realize that this particular product can be looked at with a different kind of view in their daily lives, and so on. So, have you seen someone ironing the toast to eat later on? So, that is a wild kind of a thought when you think about these kind of things in older products and a newer usage and so on. On the lighter side, people tend to, I saw one advertisement wherein that they show that a refrigerator is, when it's worn out, it's used as an almirah. So, that is on the lighter side, but again old product with a newer kind of a usage that comes in. And you have famous examples like Listerine and so on. So, several other examples are there. Now, let us look at the patterns associated with innovation vis-a-vis entrepreneurship and evolution of innovation as advocated by or proposed by two thinkers or two thought processes or schools of thought, if you would like to say that. So, one is random and other is systematic. So, random school of thought, Joseph Schumpeter talks about random thought, wherein random process, wherein he says that there is an entrepreneur associated with as far as innovation perspective goes. Then there is an entrepreneurial risk associated with because there is a perspective of an unknown associated with where do you tend to go as far as innovation is associated. And because entrepreneurial risk is further substantiated by trial and error, because you are moving towards unknown and it is a random kind of a thing. So, you go for trial and error, and so many people actually support this kind of a thought process. They say that if you do not try and you do not try to address the errors, how would you reach to a different kind of a result which might entirely be new, or let us say your desired goal would be achieved and so on. So, there are several efforts which are being made only on trials and errors related to the evolution of products and processes. So, and then Joseph Schumpeter says that there is a learning associated with failures, wherein you should be looking towards failures as ladder to success. So, the perspective here is when you try and you face the error, you face the failure, then you go for further improvement and incremental changes. But definitely it has a perspective of cost, it has a perspective of time, it has a perspective of market choices which might change by the time you get an improvement in this kind of a product. Did I refer to Joss Polymers sometime in my previous discussions, wherein this company, they came up with PET based jars and bottles at a time when almost no one was there in this country, and they were flooded with the orders which they were getting from all the sides. But when they were utilizing this machine for producing the product, they realized that actually it is a very lightweight product and it cannot be transferred to faraway places without extra cost, number one. Number two, they realize that the kind of dyes which they are using in this kind of a product, it makes almost all the difference, wherein if you have a multiple dye machine, then you are producing products of different shapes simultaneously, and if you have order related to one product, the other products would go to inventory. So, there are several aspects which you would learn, but and Joss Polymers did learn about this kind of these kind of failures they faced. In the meanwhile, the other companies, they developed the market for themselves. They entered into the same segment which Joss Polymers tend to address. They got the orders which Joss Polymers could not furnish, or they developed new orders as well. And by the time Joss Polymers learned from their failures and came out of the losses they were incurring, the market took a different kind of a shape, and they lost the train. So, it also happens many a times, wherein for example, small car segment in India got a very large impetus recently in past 5 or 6 years or a decade or so now. But then there were things associated with that, how this small car market would respond to in times to come, and we realize by the time one or two companies they learn from their mistakes, they tend to produce a product which could be acceptable more as far as the small car market goes. By the time market changed its preference and shape, and fundamentally it lost its concern towards these kind of products. So and then another aspect which this random school of thought says, that there is a matter of DNA and culture associated with as far as innovation goes. So if someone tends to be innovative, he would be, otherwise it can't be developed so easily. Then there are units of experimentations and spin-offs which are being referred to, and that is how risk taking or risk avoiding comes into being, and Schumpeter school of thought. You may check upon this random innovation based Schumpeterian thought on other sources as well. Systematic school of thought, or let us say systematic side of thinking as far as innovation goes, it says that there has to be a pattern, and it is actually pattern based, and if you look towards things with an abductive kind of an analysis, you would realize that things have been continuously evolving, and then you draw conclusions from that kind of an evolution, and structure and restructure the products. So it says that there is a way of thinking, you have to just calmly analyze that way of thinking and draw a pattern out of it, and then you come out of a product which actually minimizes the risk with, and it says that it is definitely associated with theory, it has a basis, it has a perspective associated with itself. So and we find that several products they have been looked upon with similar kind of perspective. Aeroplanes, they came with similar kind of an approach, and wherein theoretical framework was there, and then you have steam engines which were associated with similar kind of telephone came in because of this kind of thing. So we realize that radical innovation, there are several radical innovation based examples which have evolved in due course of time with the help of a pattern based way of thinking and theory supporting that. Then comes in the context of methodologies, and it says that methodological framework has to be visualized to address these kind of this kind of an innovation. And then there is an analytical framework, how to look at it, and how to analyze that, where would be the flaws and where would be this chance of success. So there are so many programming based kind of analytical frameworks now, and there is a structured analysis on and there are several algorithms which exist today, and if not, then when if someone is an expert of his own field, someone can definitely think in terms of that what kind of factors would play a role here, and those factors can be collated and visualized to corroborate with each other in due course of time. So and it talks about opportunity maximizing and risk minimizing kind of a thing as well. So it says that when you go by a pattern with the perspective of way of thinking, and take support of theory, get associated with theory, and there is a methodological and analytical framework associated with that. So definitely there is a perspective wherein opportunity is maximized and risk is minimized, and which gives you an impetus, and it says that it can be termed as value innovation school, wherein you derive more value. Although I would not digress into how this value and this random perspective, value based perspective and random based perspective can be looked at with a fundamental thought process which humans are born with, but definitely there is a context to how we look at it, and the context, just to give you a clue, is related with sensitivity and concern, as I was saying yesterday, or let us say in our last discussion. So that is where these two patterns, or let us say these two perspectives can be seen with reference to innovation, and that is where I rest this discussion. Thank you.